I doubt there are very many of you here today who spend much time wandering around cemeteries. And that's really not surprising, since for a very long time now, cemeteries have been set apart from the usual flow of daily life. Places then that required a special trip, and therefore places we tend to visit only occasionally, if even then. In fact, I doubt very many of us have even set foot in a cemetery, except for perhaps a funeral service, in months. That didn't used to be the case. Back in the day when cemeteries were located right next to the church in the center of town, in fact, in many cases, literally surrounding the church, so that you went to the graveyard pretty much every time you went to church. Kind of a reminder of what this is all about. Other than funerals, I can't tell you the last time that I was in a cemetery. But there was a time in my life when I did spend time in cemeteries on a fairly regular basis. That cemetery was the cemetery in Cool Springs, where my grandparents all lived and which we visited on a regular basis all throughout the time I was growing up. And when we were there on Sundays, and we usually were there over the weekend, and we always went to church, the Cool Springs Church, pictures of which appeared in a recent issue of our newsletter, thanks to Fred Barfoot, who made the pilgrimage to Cool Springs. My parents would always stand around after the service out in the parking lot, talking to the people with whom they'd grown up, old friends. And they would stand there talking for what seemed like hours, leaving my brother and me to entertain ourselves until they were ready to go. And there being really nothing else to do, my brother and I wandered around the cemetery, where numerous of our relatives are buried. And I got to know that cemetery very well. And the thing that always struck me about that cemetery, and the same is true of all old cemeteries, what really struck me, particularly as a child, was the number of children who were buried there, including two of my mother's siblings and one of my father's. Children, very often young children. And to this day, I think of that every time I hear someone start up about the good old days. Because the good old days weren't very good for children. Just another reminder of the fact that compared to the vast majority of people in this world, and compared to nearly everyone who lived in the years before us, you and I today live very sheltered lives. Lives that are largely insulated from many, if not most, of the threats that have plagued human existence since the beginning of time, not the least among them typhus, which claimed the lives of many of those children buried in the Cool Springs Cemetery. And thank God for the sheltered existence that we do live, since there is no way that any of us would want to trade places with people who lived in such times. Frankly, most of the threats to our well-being that you and I have to contend with today are largely self-inflicted, the direct result of our, frankly, overindulgent lifestyles, and born of a kind of recklessness that is the outgrowth of our overconfidence in coming to think of ourselves as pretty much immune to everything. In fact, we lead such a sheltered existence these days, at least compared with previous generations, that I think it's had a subtle and yet ultimately quite profound influence upon the nature of our religious faith. Again, when compared with that of previous generations, beginning with the way that you and I think about God. You see, precisely because we do, for the most part, live in such a calm and orderly world, and because so much of what happens around us in the course of our daily lives unfolds with an almost clock-like predictability, we have come to see the hand of God in the events that take place in our world as all but invisible. We just don't see the hand of God very much. Oh, maybe when viewing a particularly beautiful sunset or visiting the Grand Canyon, we might be moved to reflect upon God's marvelous handiwork. But I suspect it's pretty rare that we have such a thought simply in the course of daily life. So little occasion do we normally have to think such thoughts. Which is why, no matter what we may say here in church, I think most people, perhaps even most Christians, seem to think and act as if God created this world in the beginning and then has pretty much left it to run itself, more or less on its own, which is not all that different from the old deist conception of the clockmaker God, God who made the earth, wound it up, and then just left it to run. And if that is, in fact, how people these days think of God, and I believe it is, that would also explain then why, when things happen to disrupt our very calm and orderly world, and especially when that happens seemingly caused by some malevolent force, for example, the events of September 11th, or the recent tragedy in Orlando, or even the horrible course of events unfolding still daily in Syria, when confronted by things like that, we sometimes get very upset and even quite fearful. And I think it's because deep down inside, we're not really sure that the God that we've come to know from this nice, orderly, secure world of ours can really handle that kind of evil. The kind of evil that from time to time rears its ugly head in the world out there. I mean, it's one thing to come up with a beautiful sunset. Another thing to go head to head with the kind of demonic forces that are clearly present in this world, though thank God not so much in our midst. And I think we see that fear, the fear that God might not be able to handle the really nasty forms of evil in this world, the unsettling fear that even God may be in over his head when dealing with things like ISIS. I think we see that exact same fear in our Old Testament lesson this morning. That wonderful story of Elijah's flight into the wilderness. You see, Elijah had started off his career as a prophet with a bang in a dramatic confrontation with the priest of a foreign religious cult that had been brought to Israel by King Ahab's foreign-born wife, a woman named Jezebel, who was the daughter of the king of the neighboring kingdom of Tyre. And Elijah's confrontation with the priest of Baal had gone so well. Victory had come so easily that I don't doubt but that Elijah had begun to think that prevailing in the ongoing struggle for Israel's soul was going to be all that difficult. Indeed, I wouldn't be surprised if he didn't come away thinking that ultimate victory was all but won. But then Elijah encountered Jezebel. And for the first time in his life, he was confronted with someone the likes of which he had never experienced. A person of an extremely twisted character and as mean as a snake. I mean, this person was evil. And when faced by someone that nasty, Elijah, who up until then had been the king of the hill on top of the world, Elijah suddenly folded like a house of cards and literally turned tail and ran for his life. He was plunged by this turn of events into the deepest of despair and forced to acknowledge to himself that when push had come to shove, he turned out to be no better than all those who had gone before him. No better than all those people who had sold their souls in the service of Ahab and Jezebel, all those whom Elijah had condemned, only to discover that he was no different from them. It was a sad discovery in his case. And having fled deep into the wilderness, Elijah literally laid down to die. But then, according to the story, and as you read this story, you can tell it's one that Elijah no doubt told over and over again over the years. God sent a messenger to provide him with sustenance for the journey that lay ahead. And thus refreshed, Elijah continued on for 40 days and 40 nights. Sound familiar? Before coming to the mountain of God, the mountain that Elijah calls Horeb, though you probably know it better as Sinai, the very mountain where years before God had appeared to Moses in the burning bush and had there sent Moses back to Egypt to confront a pretty nasty opponent himself, that of course being the Pharaoh. And God came to Elijah there at Horeb, just as God had come to Moses, and asked Elijah the same question that God has on occasion asked all of us at times over the course of our lives. He said, Elijah, what are you doing here? And Elijah answered God by reciting a veritable litany of his woes. Lord, the Israelites have forsaken your covenant. They've torn down your altars and killed all your prophets. I'm the only one left, and they're looking for me. And Elijah says all this as if it was somehow news to God. Needless to say, his dealings with Jezebel had left Elijah pretty much shaken up. And so God appears here to Elijah to remind Elijah just who God really is. You see, first there was this howling wind, so strong that it shattered mountains. But that wasn't God. As much as you and I might think that's the sort of thing God might do. Then there was an earthquake with the mountain trembling beneath him, but that wasn't God either. Then a fire, but again, no God. And finally there was the King James Bible called a still small voice. What modern translations say was the sound of sheer silence. I'm not sure there's any good way to capture in words all that is intended here, which is something like a sound that is beyond all sounds. A presence beyond any dimension of which you and I have knowledge or experience, a force, a power, a strength far beyond that that can be measured in any way in our world. Sheer and absolute silence. And then for a second time, the question, Elijah, what are you doing here? You see, Elijah, having had his eyes open to the reality of the evil that is present in this world, also needed to have his eyes open to the reality of God's presence in this world. Because the greatest danger that I think we face is our fearing that God may not be up to dealing with the evil that is present around us, and therefore we might be tempted to reach some accommodation with that evil, that we simply try to live with it, and somehow minimize its harmful effect upon our lives. Or like Elijah, we may simply try to run away from the evil, find a cave somewhere that we can hide in. But there's no need for that. Because Scripture assures us that God can handle the evil in our world. And as powerful as the forces of evil may be, and they are, still God is vastly more powerful than that. And in due time, God will, of an absolute certainty, overcome the evil in this world in all its forms. That will happen. In the meantime, our job is to stand up against the evil in our midst, to draw a line in the sand and say to the evil among us, no more. No more. And not because you and I are so strong that the evil must succumb to us, but because God is so strong. And it is God's strength to which we are called to testify. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, to whom be all glory and honor, now and forevermore.